October 24, 1944. The Philippine sea night has swallowed the horizon. The Pacific, once serene and endless, now trembles beneath the growl of engines and the thud of distant guns. Aboard the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, Captain Moriyama peers into the darkness, searching for an enemy he cannot see. The ocean that had sheltered Japan for centuries lies beneath him, vast and silent. But tonight it offers no comfort. Then, light. A single flare blooms over the black waves, falling slowly like a dying star. A moment later, the horizon erupts in flame. American shells scream across the sea, their trails burning white through the humid night. The ocean glows, orange, violent, alive with fire. Through the thick smoke, silhouettes of Japanese ships twist in agony. The captains shout orders drowned by explosions. Waves rise in bursts of shrapnel and oil. The divine waters they once believed would shield the empire are now boiling with American fury. For the first time in centuries, Japan's warriors realize the sea no longer belongs to them. The night has changed everything. In the years leading to that burning night, Japan had built its confidence upon the ocean's vastness. It was not arrogance alone, it was history. For centuries, the Pacific had been Japan's fortress, its moat, its divine boundary. The empire's military planners believed that any invading force would bleed itself dry long before reaching the home islands. When war erupted in 1941, that belief seemed justified. Japanese warships swept through the Pacific with precision and ferocity, striking Pearl Harbor, sinking the Prince of Wales and Repulse, overrunning island after island. Their fleet, disciplined and well-drilled, appeared unstoppable. The Imperial Navy was the pride of Asia, a force of steel and tradition that ruled by speed and surprise. But as the tide of war stretched into its third year, Japan's confidence began to crumble under the weight of reality. The Americans, once staggered, rebuilt with a fury unmatched in modern history. Shipyards from California to Maine pulsed day and night, launching new carriers, destroyers, and submarines at a pace no empire could match. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy had not only recovered, but surpassed Japan in both quantity and quality. The Pacific was no longer a shield. It had become a highway, a route for American industry to roll forward island by island. Japan's strategic plan, the so-called decisive battle doctrine, depended on luring the U.S. fleet into one catastrophic engagement near the home islands. There, Japanese forces would unleash their remaining battleships and carriers in a grand, annihilating strike. It was a concept born from tradition, a vision that the same ocean which protected them would one day deliver their greatest victory. But the Americans refused to fight by that script. Instead of charging headlong into Japan's defenses, Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur orchestrated a methodical island-hopping campaign, seizing one island at a time, building airfields and bases ever closer to Japan's shores. Each step bypassed Japanese strongholds, leaving garrisons stranded and supplies cut. For Japan, every mile lost across the Pacific felt like losing another piece of its sacred shield. By early 1944, the Americans had captured the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, placing the Japanese homeland within range of U.S. B-29 bombers. The once invincible Imperial Navy had been mauled at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a clash so lopsided. It was later called the Great Marianas Turkey. Shoot! Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day, along with irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Japanese Navy still possessed mighty battleships, but without air cover, they were relics waiting for destruction. And yet, Tokyo refused to concede defeat. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, proposed one last gamble, a massive, coordinated naval operation to halt the American advance into the Philippines, the vital link between Japan and its southern resources in oil and minerals. If the Philippines fell, Japan's empire would be strangled. Thus was born Operation Shogo. Operation Victory. It was a desperate plan, divided into 4 simultaneous thrusts. The Japanese would send multiple fleets from different directions, north, center, and south, converging on the Leyte Gulf, where American forces under General MacArthur were landing. The northern force, with the remaining carriers, would act as bait, drawing away Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. Meanwhile, the center and southern forces, led by seasoned admirals Kurita, Nishimura, and Shima, would strike at the vulnerable American invasion fleet from behind. If the deception worked, Japan hoped to crush the American landing and reclaim the Philippines, restoring faith in the ocean's protection. But deep within the Imperial Navy's command rooms, doubt had begun to seep through. Fuel was scarce, pilots were inexperienced, communications were unreliable, and the enemy, equipped with radar, reconnaissance aircraft, and an industrial supply chain without limit, seemed to know Japan's every move. Still, the order was given. In October 1944, Japan's fleets departed their harbors in silence, bound for a final confrontation across the same waters they once ruled. As the sun set over the Philippine Sea, the admirals still believed the vast ocean could conceal their approach. They did not yet know that the Americans were already watching and waiting. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, blue by day, black by night, a deceptive veil beneath which the Imperial Navy moved toward destiny. To Admiral Takeo Kurita, commander of the Japanese Center Force, the voyage toward Leyte was both an honor and a sentence. His task was immense, to lead the largest remaining formation of Japanese battleships, including the super battleship Yamato, the pride of the empire, through the narrow straits of the Philippines, strike the American invasion fleet, and turn the tide of war. But even before his ships reached combat, the sea betrayed them. American submarines, Darter and Dace, prowling the Palawan Passage, detected Kurita's column as it threaded through the islands. In a few short minutes, 2 heavy cruisers, Atago and Maya, were torn apart by torpedoes. Hundreds of men vanished into the waves. Kurita himself was thrown into the water, surviving only by chance. The decisive fleet had not even seen its enemy, and already it bled. Far to the north, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decoy force steamed toward the Philippines with 4 carriers, nearly empty of aircraft. Their mission was suicidal by design, to lure Halsey's powerful American carriers away from Leyte Gulf. The carriers would serve as bait, nothing more. The Japanese High Command accepted that sacrifice as necessary. The ocean would hide their true strike from American eyes. But the Americans no longer needed eyes. They had radar. They had reconnaissance aircraft. They had broken Japan's naval codes months earlier. From the moment Kurita's ships left Brunei Bay, they were shadowed. American patrol planes traced their movement, and submarines prowled their route like wolves in dark water. Each transmission, each movement, was logged, analyzed, and fed into a strategy room that glowed with plotting lights and calm efficiency. On the American side, Admiral William "Bull" Halsey commanded the mighty Third Fleet. Fast carriers, battleships, and hundreds of support ships stretched across the Pacific horizon. His task was clear: protect the Leyte landings and annihilate any Japanese naval threat. Supporting him was Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, tasked with covering the invasion beaches and controlling the narrow Surigao Strait. Between them lay coordination and risk. As the Japanese advanced, Halsey's flyers scoured the skies, hammering the enemy with relentless strikes. On October 24th, waves of American aircraft descended upon Kurita's central force as it passed through the Sibuyan Sea. The attack was merciless. The battleship Musashi, sister ship of Yamato and one of the largest warships ever built, absorbed dozens of bombs and torpedoes before finally rolling over, disappearing beneath the water in a slow, tragic descent. The loss shook Kurita's men to their core. If even the Musashi could be destroyed from the air, what chance did the rest of them have? Kurita briefly turned his fleet around, a decision that sowed confusion both within his own command and among the watching Americans. Admiral Halsey, receiving reports of Ozawa's northern carriers, believed the main threat was to the north. He did not yet realize Kurita was still coming, through the narrow San Bernardino Strait, directly toward the unprotected American landing force. As night fell on October 24th, the ocean darkened to black glass. Kurita reformed his battered fleet and pressed onward. To the south, another Japanese force under Admiral Nishimura approached through the Surigao Strait, unaware that American battleships, commanded by Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, were waiting in ambush. 3 separate Japanese groups, scattered and wounded, steamed toward Leyte. Their faith in the sea's protection had led them into the jaws of a trap. In Tokyo, the naval staff still spoke of decisive battle, of honor, destiny, and divine intervention. But in the black waters of the Philippines, technology and reality were rewriting the rules of war. The Japanese captains believed the ocean would protect them. By the next night, the ocean itself would betray them, glowing with fire, revealing every ship that tried to hide. The stage was set. The fleets were closing. And as darkness returned to the Pacific, each side prepared for the kind of battle the world had never seen before. On the human angle on every Japanese bridge, the faces told the same story. Discipline masking fear. The captains who led the Imperial Navy into the Philippine waters were men raised on legend. They had studied the victories of Tsushima, the writings of Mahan, the doctrine of decisive battle that defined Japan's entire naval philosophy. To them, the sea was sacred, a living boundary between the divine homeland and the foreign world beyond. But the men beneath them, the sailors, the gunners, the mechanics deep in the steel corridors, felt something else. They knew the truth, whispered in mess halls and bunk rooms. Japan's power was fading. Fuel rations were tight. Supplies ran thin. Even rice was scarce aboard some ships. The once gleaming decks of the fleet now echoed with fatigue. Still, duty bound them. Surrender was unthinkable. In their culture, obedience and sacrifice were the final expressions of loyalty. To die in defense of the Emperor's ocean was an honor, or so they were told. That belief, that near-religious faith in the ocean's protection, carried them forward into the dark. Yet, among the veterans, a quiet dread grew. They had seen American aircraft slice through the sky in waves. They had watched radar-guided gunnery obliterate ships long before visual contact. The Americans no longer needed daylight. They no longer needed to see their enemy. When night fell, the Japanese sailors still looked to the horizon and whispered ancient prayers. They did not realize that the night, once their element, now belonged to someone else. The tactical angle Japan had long prided itself on mastery of night combat. In the early years of the Pacific War, Japanese destroyers had ruled the darkness. Their training was unmatched. Silent coordination, accurate torpedoes, and precise communication by signal light. American ships, clumsy and inexperienced in those early encounters, had suffered heavy losses at Savo Island, Java, and other engagements. But by 1944, that era had ended. The U.S. Navy had evolved. Every lesson from those early defeats had been studied, dissected, and corrected. American ships now carried radar, powerful, precise, and deadly. To the Japanese, the night was still an art. To the Americans, It had become a science. Radar turned darkness into daylight. Commanders could track approaching ships miles away, adjust firing solutions automatically, and unleash broadsides with mathematical precision. The result was devastating. Coordinated fire from multiple directions before the Japanese even knew they were spotted. The Japanese still relied on human sight, on the glint of a wave or the silhouette of a mast. Against radar, those instincts were useless. During the approach to Surigao Strait, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf arranged his ships in a classic battle formation, crossing the enemy's path with overwhelming firepower. The Japanese would steam directly into a wall of shells, their movements illuminated by American spotlights and radar-guided salvos. The tactical contrast was stark. The Imperial Navy was fighting the last war. The Americans were fighting the next. Still, the Japanese pressed on, compelled by honor, duty, and the ghost of tradition. In their minds, courage could still defeat machines. The sea, vast and ancient, would balance the odds. They were wrong. The emotional undercurrent, to understand the battle that followed, one must grasp the emotional weight behind every order. For the Japanese, this was not just a fight for territory. It was spiritual. The sea had carried their ancestors to glory. Now it threatened to carry them to ruin. When Kurita's central force lost Musashi, the crewmen aboard the surviving ships watched the ocean swallow the giant with eerie calm. No wailing, no panic, just the slow, thunderous roll of a nation's pride disappearing beneath the waves. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Even among the officers, there was a sense that they were witnessing the end of something greater than themselves. The ocean that once defined Japan's identity as an island empire had turned traitor, a stage upon which every weakness was exposed. American sailors, by contrast, fought with a different emotion. Not spiritual awe, but resolve. For them, the Pacific was not sacred. It was strategic. They fought to end the war, to avenge Pearl Harbor, to return home. Their confidence came not from faith, but from precision, coordination, and overwhelming power. On one side, belief and sacrifice. On the other, method and momentum. As the fleets converged in the dark, that contrast became the essence of the battle itself. The old world against the new. And when the first shells crossed the water that night, it was not just two navies colliding, it was 2 centuries of warfare meeting at their breaking point. The waves shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight. Engines hummed. Orders whispered through headsets and speaking tubes. In the next moments, courage would collide with calculation. The technological angle by 1944, technology had transformed the nature of naval warfare. The Imperial Navy had once been unmatched in gunnery, armor, and torpedo design. Their ships were masterpieces of engineering, and their long-lance torpedoes remained the most advanced in the world, capable of devastating an enemy ship before it could respond. But technology is never static. The Americans had studied, adapted, and innovated. Radar, a device that Japanese captains barely understood, allowed American ships to see through darkness, rain, and smoke. Night battles that once favored experienced Japanese destroyers now favored the Americans' precise calculations. Gunnery had become automated, fire control centralized. Spotlights could illuminate targets while radar systems calculated range and trajectory simultaneously. Even the massive battleships of the Imperial Navy, designed to absorb hundreds of shells, were vulnerable to concentrated, guided barrages. Aircraft further tipped the balance. U.S. carrier-based planes could strike without warning from hundreds of miles away. Bombs and torpedoes were deployed with deadly accuracy, coordinated via radar intelligence. The once sacred night approach of Japanese admirals now faced detection long before visual contact. The ocean, thought to be a hiding place, had become a stage for technology. Every wave, every dark corner of water was monitored, tracked, and accounted for. Japanese captains realized too late that their mastery of the sea could not overcome the fusion of American innovation and industrial might. The leadership angle. Night that would define Leyte Gulf was also a clash of minds. On the Japanese side, Admiral Kurita was seasoned, cautious, and bound by tradition. His orders emphasized aggression, but were tempered by the memory of past losses. Every maneuver he made had to balance honor, risk, and the lives of men he could not afford to waste. Across the water, American leadership emphasized coordination, initiative, and flexibility. Admiral Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, embodied aggressive forward thinking, daring yet calculated. Admiral Oldendorf, waiting in Surigao Strait, mastered the art of classical naval formation, ready to trap Kurita's ships in a deadly crossfire. Decisions unfolded rapidly, sometimes in hours, sometimes in minutes. When Kurita hesitated, weighing honor against risk, American leaders had already deployed aircraft, battleships, and destroyers to anticipate every move. The contrast was stark. Japanese naval command relied on doctrine and instinct. American command relied on intelligence, communication, and speed. Leadership was not abstract. It was lethal. Every choice, every hesitation dictated who would survive the night and who would become a casualty. The enemy angle, for the Japanese captains, the enemy remained both familiar and unknowable. They knew the Americans were resourceful, relentless, and growing stronger. They remembered Midway, Coral Sea, and the relentless push across the Pacific. Yet the enemy they faced now was different, larger, faster, more technologically equipped. Kurita's men expected to encounter battleships and carriers in predictable formations. Instead, they found a networked enemy, unseen yet omnipresent. Radar-guided fire could strike ships beyond visual range. Air attacks arrived without warning. Submarines lurked in every passage. The American crews understood the same dynamic. They had seen the enemy's pride and reliance on tradition. They knew that fear, honor, and superstition would shape Japanese decisions, and they exploited it. Each ambush, each engagement was informed not just by maps, but by psychology. By nightfall, both sides had learned something profound. The ocean itself was no longer neutral. It had become an active battlefield, shaped by men, machines, and knowledge. The moral angle. There was a moral weight to the Japanese belief in oceanic protection. The doctrine of decisive battle was not merely strategic, it was ethical. To retreat, to fail, or to lose honor was to fail one's nation, one's emperor, and one's own code. Men sailed into fire not merely because of orders, but because of ingrained duty, the kind that demands sacrifice beyond reason. The Americans, by contrast, fought with a different moral clarity, to stop an aggressor, to secure lives ashore, to win a war that had already destroyed millions. Victory was tied to survival, not honor. The night that the ocean glowed would reveal the clash of these moral universes. Japanese sailors, expecting reverence from the sea, faced annihilation instead. American sailors, expecting resistance, found an enemy willing to die for a principle that no longer served strategy. In those hours, courage met calculation, belief met science, and the myths of the sea collided with the relentless logic of modern warfare. The night lay heavy over the Philippine waters. Kurita's battered center force had pressed north through the Sibuyan Sea, its hulls slick with salt and fuel, its decks littered with the remnants of airstrikes. The Musashi had already sunk, a colossal reminder of vulnerability. The survivors moved with grim determination. Every man knew that the ocean they had trusted could no longer protect them. Meanwhile, to the south, Admiral Oldendorf had deployed a formation that would soon be etched into naval history. Battleships and cruisers lined the Surigao Strait in a deadly crossing the T, waiting for Nishimura's southern force to steam directly into their line. Destroyers bristled with torpedoes, ready to strike. Spotlights rotated across the waves, casting the advancing Japanese ships into harsh relief. For Nishimura, the night seemed endless, but unavoidable. Torpedoes struck first, slicing through the formation before the main engagement began. Then American battleships opened fire. Shells tore through the Japanese hulls, lighting up the water in orange blooms, smoke coiling skyward. One by one, ships began to list, roll, and sink. The southern force was obliterated. More than 3,000 men lost, ships destroyed, dreams shattered. The Japanese high command in Tokyo could not yet comprehend the scale of the disaster unfolding far from sight. Kurita, hearing the devastation to the south, faced a dilemma. He had the larger fleet, but it had been weakened by airstrikes in the Sibuyan Sea. The Yamato and other battleships were intact but scarred. His mission was to reach Leyte Gulf and strike the invasion force. Yet, hesitation gnawed at him. The night was no longer a shield, and every decision carried the weight of life and honor. Radar screens on American cruisers and destroyers tracked his every movement. Aircraft from Task Force 77 harried his ships relentlessly. Kurita's men fired back into darkness, torpedoes streaking silently through waves. But the U.S. formations adapted quickly, weaving evasively while returning devastating fire. The sea seemed alive with destruction. The divine waters the Japanese had trusted were now glowing with the reflection of fire and steel. Explosions rocked the decks. Smoke clung to every mast and funnel. Sailors crouched, gripping rails, waiting for the next barrage. At 03 Daoku Freefers, at our youth tour, Kurita made a fateful decision. Instead of retreating, he pressed on toward San Bernardino Strait. His goal, engage the American landing forces at Leyte. Each mile forward was a gamble, a test of courage, strategy, and survival. Meanwhile, Halsey's Northern Third Fleet had taken the bait of Ozawa's decoy carriers. They steamed north in pursuit, leaving the invasion force temporarily exposed. It was the perfect trap. The Japanese believed they had free passage, yet the Americans had already anticipated Kurita's approach. As dawn approached, Kurita's center force emerged into a morning smothered with mist. American escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy 3, far outgunned, were positioned unexpectedly. The Japanese assumed easy targets. What they encountered instead were planes and destroyers launching desperate, coordinated attacks. Torpedoes streaked from multiple directions, bombers descended from above, and guns opened fire from ships thought insignificant in the greater naval hierarchy. The first volleys struck the Japanese lead cruisers, ripping holes through armor and splintering decks. Confusion and chaos spread across the formation. The calculated ritualistic warfare they had relied on for decades faltered against the ingenuity and aggression of a smaller, desperate enemy. Kurita's fleet, the pride of Japan, had arrived at Leyte, but not to victory. The ocean they had trusted had betrayed them, revealing every weakness, every gap in strategy, every overconfidence. Each explosion, each sinking, each screaming sailor was proof that faith alone could not save the fleet. In that moment, it became clear. The myth of invincibility was dead. The ocean, once a protector, had become a mirror reflecting failure. The stage was set for the decisive decisions of the day. Kurita would either press the attack and risk annihilation, or withdraw and preserve what remained. The moment demanded courage beyond doctrine and instinct beyond tradition. The fire on the horizon signaled the turning point of the battle. A night of Japanese expectation colliding with American preparation, strategy, and unrelenting force. What followed in the hours after dawn would define not only the outcome of Leyte Gulf, but the death of Japan's naval dominance in the Pacific. October 25, 1944, Leyte Gulf, the Battle off Samar. The first light of dawn revealed a chaotic tableau on the waters east of Leyte. Kurita's center force, battered but still formidable, pressed into the Philippine Sea. From the mist emerged the small, seemingly insignificant American task group known as Taffy 3, escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts, numbering a fraction of Kurita's battleships and cruisers. To the Japanese captains, these were minor targets, easy prey for the pride of the Imperial Navy. Confidence coursed through the bridges. The ocean would protect them from surprise. They had seen nothing that could challenge their centuries of maritime tradition, but appearances were deceptive. American destroyers surged forward with ferocious speed, laying down torpedo barrages against the larger Japanese ships. Planes from escort carriers dived and strafed with relentless intensity. Despite their limited numbers, the Americans exploited mobility, coordination, and sheer audacity to offset their disadvantage. Kurita's battleships and heavy cruisers responded with massive gunfire. Each salvo lit up the dawn, creating columns of smoke and fire across the gray water. The explosions threw spray into the air, cascading over deck crews. Japanese officers shouted orders through the chaos, yet coordination faltered under the relentless, unexpected assault. From the American side, courage and improvisation defined the response. Pilots launched themselves into the face of overwhelming firepower. Destroyers maneuvered within yards of battleships, daring to fire torpedoes and then vanish into smoke and haze. Men risked everything to protect their carriers and the soldiers landing on Leyte's beaches. By År 744, the center force had suffered significant damage. Heavy cruisers were ablaze. Battleships like the Congo and Haruna struggled with hits that compromised their speed and armament. Kurita faced the impossible. Press forward to strike the invasion fleet, or retreat and preserve his remaining force. The decision came slowly, the weight of history pressing on every command. Kurita's formation, already fragmented by previous strikes, lacked cohesion. Communication lines failed, and the threat of air attacks from nearby carriers intensified. The sea that had once seemed a protective barrier now offered no sanctuary. Finally, Kurita gave the order to withdraw. The center force turned back toward the northern passages. Ships limped through the water, wounded but alive, leaving behind burning hulks and the bodies of thousands. The American defenders, battered and outgunned, had held. Courage, innovation, and desperation had defeated tradition, firepower, and pride. The ocean had indeed glowed with American fire, but it had also revealed the limits of belief and the reality of modern warfare. In Tokyo, disbelief and grief spread through the naval staff. The Empire's navy, once untouchable, had failed to halt the American advance. The myth of invincibility, carefully nurtured for decades, was shattered on waters they had once called their own. Meanwhile, in Surigao Strait, Oldendorf's ambush had completed its lethal work. The southern force was annihilated. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were either sunk or crippled. The classic crossing the T tactic had delivered devastating results. Japanese captains learned a painful lesson. Careful planning, technological advantage, and coordination could overcome numerical skill and historical experience. The combination of Surigao Strait and Samar meant that Japan's naval power in the Pacific was no longer capable of challenging the Americans effectively. Fuel shortages, depleted air groups, and the loss of seasoned commanders compounded the disaster. Even the largest remaining ships, including the Yamato, were strategically irrelevant without aircraft support. The night that Japanese captains had expected to protect them with the vast Pacific had transformed into a crucible of destruction. Each fire, each explosion, each sinking was a testament to the irreversible shift in naval warfare, from reliance on tradition and faith to technology, intelligence, and industrial capacity. By the end of the day, Kurita's retreat signaled more than a tactical withdrawal. It marked the death of Japan's hope to reclaim control over the Pacific through fleet action. The Americans, though exhausted, had demonstrated that smaller, agile forces, supported by technology and audacity, could triumph over the largest battleships in the world. The ocean, once thought a guardian, had revealed itself as a proving ground for modern strategy. For the Japanese, it was a lesson written in fire and blood. As dusk fell, the sea returned to its deceptive calm. Smoke still spiraled from burning decks. Waves carried debris, oil, and bodies, reminders of the night when history changed. The captains who survived could only stare across the water, aware that the ocean no longer guaranteed protection. The stage was set for the aftermath. Shattered fleets, lost men, and a strategic recalibration that would define the remaining months of the Pacific War. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf was both immediate and staggering. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the losses were catastrophic, not only in material, but in morale. The southern force, annihilated at Surigao Strait, had been almost entirely wiped out. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers sank in flames, leaving only fragments of a once mighty formation. Thousands of sailors perished, swallowed by the sea they had trusted to shield them. Kurita's center force, though it survived the battle off Samar, emerged battered and demoralized. Ships were crippled by shellfire, torpedoes, and airstrikes. Many were unable to continue operations effectively, and the fleet's cohesion was irrevocably broken. Survivors recounted the terror of explosions in the dark, the cries of men trapped below decks, and the disorienting mix of fire, smoke, and water that turned the night into a living nightmare. American forces had suffered losses, too, but the scale was starkly different. Escort carriers and destroyers endured damage, and brave sailors paid with their lives. Yet their defensive success turned a desperate stand into a decisive victory. Against overwhelming odds, the smaller, less heavily armed Taffy III had prevented the destruction of the Leyte landing forces. Their courage reshaped the tactical narrative of the engagement. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was profound. The myth of the invincible fleet, a doctrine passed down from Tsushima and Midway, was shattered. Even the most disciplined officers began to question the wisdom of relying on the ocean as a protective shield. Fuel shortages, inexperienced crews, and depleted air cover meant that any future fleet action would be limited at best, reckless at worst. For the Americans, Leyte Gulf confirmed the strategic advantage of modern naval warfare. Radar-guided gunnery, coordinated air support, and intelligence-driven tactics had rendered traditional Japanese doctrines obsolete. The ocean was no longer a refuge for a nation. It was a battlefield defined by information, technology, and relentless execution. The scale of destruction was staggering. In Surigao Strait alone, the southern force lost battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in a matter of hours. The center force, though retreating, lost a heavy cruiser and several destroyers to air attacks. Thousands of Japanese sailors were dead, many more wounded or captured. The American Navy recorded only minimal ship losses in comparison, underscoring the tactical and technological disparities that now dominated the Pacific. For the Japanese public, news of the defeat was difficult to digest. Tokyo's propaganda machine struggled to explain the loss without acknowledging the scale of destruction. In private, naval officers recognized the historical reality. The Imperial Navy could no longer control the seas in any meaningful way. Any hope of reversing the tide of the war through a decisive fleet engagement had vanished. The night when the ocean glowed with American fire had changed the balance of power in the Pacific permanently. Japan retained ships, but they were shadows of their former might, vulnerable, scattered, and incapable of challenging American dominance. The psychological and strategic consequences would ripple through every decision in the remaining months of the war. Yet even in the shadow of defeat, the courage displayed by Japanese crews was undeniable. They fought with valor, perseverance, and a belief in tradition that clashed tragically with the modern realities of warfare. Their sacrifice became a grim testament to the cost of clinging to obsolete doctrines in the face of an evolving enemy. The stage was now set for the broader consequences. Strategic, operational, and psychological, that would redefine the Pacific theater. The full consequences of Leyte Gulf unfolded in the days and weeks after the battle. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the losses were both tangible and symbolic. 4 battleships, 6 cruisers, and 11 destroyers were sunk or heavily damaged. Aircraft losses from the decoy carriers and center force air groups were severe, eroding a critical component of Japan's naval power. Experienced pilots and seasoned sailors, the backbone of the fleet, had been destroyed. Losses that could not be replaced. Strategically, the battle marked the effective end of Japan's ability to conduct large-scale naval operations. The combined fleet, once the pride of the empire, no longer had the resources to mount a decisive counteroffensive. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. By the end of 1944, Japan could scarcely operate more than a fraction of its remaining ships, leaving the once sacred ocean almost entirely under American control. The psychological impact was equally profound. Japanese commanders had believed the vast Pacific would shield them, giving time and space to execute a decisive strike. Leyte Gulf shattered that belief. Reports from surviving captains described the night as surreal. The ocean glowing with fire, ships exploding in succession, the screams of men lost at sea. It became clear that the traditions, honor codes, and doctrines that had guided the Navy for decades were inadequate against modern technology and tactics. For the American forces, the battle was a demonstration of the synergy between intelligence, technology, and initiative. The codebreakers, radar operators, and coordinated air and naval tactics had neutralized an enemy that far outclassed certain American units on paper. The courage of smaller vessels, particularly the escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy III, showcased the effectiveness of adaptive leadership and flexible tactics. In essence, the battle proved that resourcefulness and strategy could outweigh size and firepower in the modern era. The impact on the Philippine campaign was immediate. With Japan's fleet weakened and scattered, the American invasion of Leyte continued with far less resistance. Supplies and reinforcements flowed unimpeded to the landing beaches. Morale among American soldiers and sailors surged, contrasting starkly with the demoralization aboard Japanese ships. Numbers tell the story vividly. The Southern Force lost nearly all its ships, with over 3,500 sailors killed. Kurita's center force suffered hundreds of casualties, and multiple ships were permanently disabled. In contrast, the Americans lost just a handful of ships, with fewer than 1,000 casualties across the entire engagement. These figures reflected not only tactical success, but a historic shift in naval power. Politically and strategically, Leyte Gulf sealed Japan's fate in the Pacific. The Philippines would be liberated, cutting the empire from its southern resource colonies. Japan's inability to contest the seas allowed American forces to advance unimpeded toward Luzon and eventually toward Okinawa. The decisive battle that Tokyo had hoped for never came. Instead, Japan's navy faced a slow, inevitable erosion. Yet amidst the wreckage and loss, a somber admiration persisted. Both sides recognized the courage of the opposing sailors. Survivors of Taffy III later recounted the ferocity of Japanese gunfire and the disciplined, almost ritualistic adherence to duty among the enemy crews. Japanese officers acknowledged that their defeat was not due to cowardice, but to the overwhelming force of innovation and preparation. Leyte Gulf thus became more than a battle. It was a historical hinge, the last major engagement where Japan's traditional doctrines met the full weight of modern, industrialized warfare. The ocean, once the protector and symbol of Japan's invincibility, had become a crucible of truth, revealing the gap between belief and reality, courage and calculation, tradition and technology. The glow of that night lingered long after the fires had faded, both on the water and in the collective consciousness of naval history. For Japan, it marked the twilight of an era. For America, it was a vindication of strategy, intelligence, and industrial might. The survivors of the Imperial Navy returned to ports reduced to shadows of what they had once commanded. Ships were repaired where possible, but the age of Japanese dominance on the Pacific Ocean had ended. The next engagements would not involve sprawling fleet clashes, but desperate, defensive actions as the Americans pushed inexorably toward the Japanese homeland. The ocean, once a shield, had now become a battlefield ruled by those who understood its new rules. The night that the ocean glowed with American fire marked more than a tactical victory. It marked a transformation in the very nature of naval warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of an empire, had been tested against the full force of modern strategy, technology, and industrial might. Ships that had seemed invincible were reduced to wrecks, and centuries of maritime tradition met the harsh reality of radar, air power, and coordinated tactics. For the Japanese sailors and officers who survived, the lessons were bitter. Courage, discipline, and faith in the ocean could no longer guarantee survival. The myth that the Pacific itself could shield an empire had been shattered, replaced by the stark knowledge that control of the sea depended on preparation, innovation, and adaptability. The ocean had revealed the truth. It was impartial, indifferent, and unforgiving. For the Americans, Leyte Gulf demonstrated the power of industrialized warfare, intelligence, and leadership. Small, agile forces, when guided by strategy and technology, could prevail against superior numbers and firepower. The courage of the men aboard escort carriers and destroyers exemplified a new type of valor, one measured not only by honor, but by ingenuity and relentless resolve. Beyond the battle itself, the glow on that night serves as a symbolic pivot in history. It signaled the end of Japan's hope to dominate the Pacific through decisive fleet action, marking the twilight of an era defined by battleship supremacy and rigid doctrines. It also heralded the rise of modern naval warfare, where information, coordination, and technology dictate outcomes more than tradition or bravado. Yet amid the destruction and loss, there is a human story. The fear, bravery, and determination on both sides remind us that war is not only measured in tonnage and tactics, but in the lives of those who navigate its fury. The ocean, once seen as a protector, became a proving ground, a stage where human courage collided with the relentless forces of change. And in that collision, history was forever altered.